Wyoming, 1890. Dusk had fallen, dyeing the wilderness red with a withered, cruel light. The wind howled like the screams of a lost soul, carrying dust and curses that littered the dry ground. In this remote town where even demons shudder, where life is a thread between countless dangers, a figure appeared defying the laws of cruelty. Emily Stone, a name woven from desert whispers and hungry glances, stepped out of the shadows of a dilapidated saloon. The sheer muslin dress, torn and patched, clung to her body like a second skin, a naked affront to the modesty of the world. Every hot curve of her hips, every heave of her chest hidden behind the thin fabric, challenged the gaze of any man who dared to face her. Her breath dissolved into the cold Wyoming air, faint as a promise of enchantment. Wild chestnut hair, untamed, fell over her shoulders, catching the last rays of the sun, burning like the flames of desire. The emerald green eyes, deep as a forbidden gem, contained a deadly invitation, able to tear apart the soul of any man who fell into them. Her full lips slightly parted, sparkling like the night dew. Each of her steps was a seductive dance, slow and deliberate, making even the dust particles under her shoes want to join in that wild rhythm. James Carter, a cowboy hollowed out by unspeakable loss, felt his blood boil, his hands tightening on the reins as a fervent desire tore at his chest. This was no place for such sinful thoughts to dwell, not in a frontier town where danger lurked more densely than the sweltering heat of 1890. Isolated plains stretched endlessly around them, rocky hills hemmed in by a settlement of ramshackle huts and outlaws, where survival required a cool head and a cold heart. James swallowed, pulling his hat down to shield his burning eyes. "I was just looking for shelter, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, trying to hold on to his last shred of dignity against the gnawing hunger. Emily's smile was a teasing one, soft but knowing as she stepped closer. The scent of sage and sweat wafted from her body, making him dizzy. "Shelter is scarce here, stranger," she whispered. Before James could reply, a dry gunshot tore through the night, and the silhouettes of horsemen appeared over the hilltop, their eyes gleaming menacingly in the rising moonlight. The sound of gunfire still echoed in James Carter's ears as he spurred his horse toward the only motel in this God-forsaken Wyoming town. The silhouettes of the knights gradually disappeared into the night behind him. The air was thick with the smell of violence, the kind of violence that clings to places where law is an empty word and men spit into the dust. His feet thudded against the ground, his legs nearly giving out after days without proper food. His weathered body was much thinner than the last time he called himself a rancher. The inn came into view, its ramshackle porch lit by a single lantern, and Emily Stone stood waiting her presence, a shock to his senses. The flimsy, tight-fitting dress, the plunging neckline, was enough to make his heart beat faster. She leaned against the doorframe, one hand gently stroking a stray lock of chestnut hair, her skin catching the lantern and light, shimmering like desert sand at sunset. "Get in, hurry," Emily spoke, her voice low and urgent, her breath a mist in the cold evening air. James followed his shoulder, brushing hers as they crossed the threshold, a casual touch that sent a jolt of electricity through him, a feeling he tried to ignore. Inside, the smell of stew and fresh bread filled his nostrils, a promise of salvation. But another figure made him pause. Sarah Brooks stood in the kitchen doorway, her steely gray eyes as sharp as knives. The blouse hugged her shoulders tightly, suggesting a sense of hidden strength within. Her chestnut hair was tied tightly into a bun, but a single strand of hair fell around her neck, catching his gaze before he could regain his composure. "You're a troublemaker, aren't you?" Sarah said, her voice defiant, her stance firm and uncompromising. James placed his hat on the table, hunger struggling with caution. "Just a man looking for a place to sleep, ma'am." Emily's hand brushed his arm as she invited him to sit, the touch gentle but lingering, stirring a fire that he tried to extinguish. The two women exchanged glances, and Sarah spoke up, the corners of her lips curving up slightly. "We need more than one guest, Mr. Carter. The town's wolves are closing in on our home, our children. We need a man to stand with us, to act as the head of the family." James's jaw tightened, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He had lost everything once: his farm, his hope, his purpose. "Can you take the risk again?" Before he could answer, a child's voice rang out from the hallway, soft and curious, breaking the tension, but not lessening the danger. "Will he stay, Mom?" The question hung like a noose, tying him to a choice he wasn't ready to make. That night, the whole town erupted in chaos. A torch blazed outside the inn, its orange light licking at the Wyoming darkness like the tongue of a predator. James Carter's hand instinctively went to the empty holster where his gun had been. His heart pounded as the shouts and hooves grew closer. The gang was coming just as Emily had warned. Their shadows were huge and hideous, imprinted on the dilapidated walls of the last refuge in town. Emily Stone stood by the window, her silhouette rigid, the sheer fabric of her dress, catching the firelight outlining the curve of her spine. Her breath caught a soft sound stirring the air. And when she turned back, her blue eyes locked on James with a mix of fear and defiance that made his throat tighten. "They want this place," she whispered, her voice soft, her lips close enough to touch his ear as she handed him a rifle. Sarah Brooks was at the door, her blouse unbuttoned just enough to reveal the pulse in her throat. Her chestnut hair was now loose, framing her face like a storm cloud. She gripped the shotgun tightly, her stance wide, every inch of her body radiating a fire that both unnerved James and attracted him. "Get down low," she said, her fingers brushing his as she handed him the bullet. The touch was brief but electric, igniting a fire he was forced to bury. The gang leader, a rough-looking man with a scarred face, roared his surrender. But James stepped onto the porch, rifle raised, his voice steady. "This house is not yours." A gunshot rang out. Wood shattered and chaos erupted. James returned fire, backed by two armed lodgers. Their loyalty was a surprise that made the gang flinch. Sarah's shotgun roared, her aim accurate, and the attackers scattered into the night, leaving only threats behind. The next morning, the air was heavy with dust and tension. Emily's hand rested on James's shoulder as she brought him coffee, her touch lingering, the smell of sage and sweat making him dizzy. "We need you more than ever," she said, her eyes searching his. Before he could reply, heavy boots pounded on the porch. Mayor Hutchins and Chief Coleman stood there, their cold eyes filled with accusations of disorderly conduct. Sarah's laugh was sharp, her posture defiant as she leaned against the doorframe. Her blouse hugged her curves. "You're late to the fight," she said, her voice daring them to press further. James stepped forward, his decision made. "This is my family now. You will deal with me." The mayor's smile was like a snake's promising trouble as he turned away, leaving the air filled with the threat of coming wars. The inn creaked under the weight of an unsettled Dane, its walls scarred from last night's fighting, as if the Wyoming wind itself were whispering warnings of what was to come. James Carter stood in the yard, his boots sinking into the dust, his eyes scanning the horizon where the gang's retreat had left a trail of trampled earth. The mayor's parting threat hung like smoke, promising a reckoning, and James knew that the next fight would not be a warning shot. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear, but there was also something new. A thin thread of trust woven between him and the women who had pulled him back from the brink of despair. Emily Stone emerged from the kitchen, her dress patched but still clinging to her figure, the morning light catching the curve of her neck as she carried a tray of bandages. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a loose bun, strands brushing against her collarbone, and when she knelt down to examine his grazed arm, her fingers lingered warm and steady, sending a jolt of electricity through him that he tried to ignore. "I'm still here," she said, her blue eyes searching his, her breathing light and close enough to stir the air between them. Sarah Brooks set to work nailing a board over the broken window. Her blouse rolled up to reveal the taut muscles of her arms. Her chestnut hair caught the sunlight like a flickering flame. She moved with a purpose that made James's chest tighten, her every gesture, a challenge to the cruelty of the world. "We can't just wait for them to come back," she said, her voice sharp, her eyes locked on his as she handed him a hammer. Their fingers touched for a moment that sparked the fire he tried to extinguish. James nodded, his past failures, a farm lost to drought, a life turned to ashes gnawing at him. But the image of Emily's son Tommy holding a rocking horse and Sarah's daughter Clara watching from the porch held him. He had failed before, but he would not let these children lose their home. Next time we will fight smarter, James said, his voice steady, the authority of an old farmer rising in him. He gathered Emily, Sarah, and a few loyal lodgers in the cramped dining room, the lantern casting dancing shadows. He taught them how to load their rifles, how to aim for the legs to slow down an attacker, not kill them. Emily's hands shook as she practiced her shoulder brushing his as she adjusted her grip on the gun, the touch unintentional but alluring, the scent of her sage and sweat blurring his concentration. Sarah quickly adjusted to the gun, as if she were born holding one, her stance firm, her blouse falling slightly to reveal the curve of her shoulders, and when she caught James looking, her lips curved into a knowing half smile that made his blood boil. He cleared his throat, focusing on the plan. Tripwires in the yard, oil tanks rigged to catch fire, a secret passage to the basement for the kids. We will hold the line at night, he said, mapping out the choke points of the house. The darkness is our ally. As night fell, the town became quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that signals an approaching storm. James stood guard, his rifle slung over his shoulder. When Emily brought him coffee, her fingers brushed his as she handed him the cup, her eyes looking at him with a vulnerability that stirred something deeper than lust. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered, her voice a soft plea. Before he could reply, Clara's sharp cry rang out in the darkness. "The nights are coming fast." James turned, heart pounding. Torches flashed across the horizon, dozens of people, their shadows swallowing the starlight. Sarah was beside him in an instant, her shotgun ready, her body close enough for him to feel the heat radiating from her, a silent promise of defiance. War is coming, and this time it will test every bit of their will to survive. The night was like a black curtain covering the Wyoming border, the kind of night that swallowed both sound and hope. As torchlight flashed like an evil eye on the horizon, James Carter took cover behind a barricade of wooden crates, his rifle dripping with sweat. The walls of the inn trembled under the weight of the approaching storm. The gang was here, dozens of strong men, their boots pounding like war drums backed by the mayor's mercenaries. The air smelled of oil and menace, and James's heart pounded not just with fear, but with the fire in Sarah Brooks's eyes as she knelt beside him, her shotgun steady. Her blouse clung to her body, damp from the cold of the night, accentuating the curve of her shoulders. Her chestnut hair fell loose, brushing his arm as she leaned down and whispered, "We hold the line." The touch was brief but warm, sending a shiver down his spine, but he shrugged it off, his focus sharp on the ghosts crawling towards them. Emily Stone was in the basement, leading the children to safety. Her dress caught on a nail as she moved, tearing open to reveal a sliver of thigh that James caught a glimpse of before looking away, guilt mingling with the pain in his chest. Her voice was soft but firm, echoing through the secret passage. "Hold them, James." He nodded, though she couldn't see it, and signaled to the lodgers, 3 men who stayed for loyalty, not money to man, the tripwire. The first trap was triggered. A barrel of oil burst into flames with a hissing sound, lighting up the night and scattering the gang's top brass. Screams followed, but the attackers continued to advance, bullets tearing through the wood. Sarah fired, her aim deadly, her body pressed against James for cover, her breath hot on his neck, stirring a fire he tried to ignore. "Load," she called, and Emily's hand appeared through the passage, passing the bullet up her fingers, brushing his. The touch of sparks and chaos. A familiar voice rang out through the gunfire. "Carter, are you still alive?" It was Ben Travis, James's old friend, a gunslinger with a smile as sharp as his aim, riding up with his rifle blazing. His appearance turned the tide, his accurate shots taking down 2 of the mayor's soldiers. James and Sarah fought side by side. Tripwire sprang, another barrel exploded in a roar of fire. The gang faltered, their numbers dwindling, but not before a stray bullet hit a lodger, Eli, in the shoulder. His groans rang out as Emily hurried to pull him to safety, her dress covered in soot, her blue eyes fierce as she pressed a cloth to his wound. A corner of the inn was ablaze, flames licking at the roof, and James's heart sank. Another house was falling apart like his farm, but Sarah's hand gripped his arm, her touch firm, her voice growling. "We're not done yet." The gang retreated under the weight of fire and traps, their curses fading into the night. But James knew this wasn't a victory, just a pause. The inn still stood, but its walls were scarred. Its roof still smoked, and Eli's blood stained the floor. Emily stepped out of the basement. Her hair tousled her chest, heaving with heavy breaths. And as she stood close, her shoulder brushing James's, he felt the pull of her warmth but remained resolute, his resolve stronger than his desire. Sarah reloaded her shotgun, her eyes meeting his, a silent vow that they would face whatever was coming together. As the first rays of dawn crept over the hills, the burden of their survival weighed down. Heavy but unbroken, a family forged in fire and defiance. Dawn breaks over the Wyoming border with a vengeance. Its pale light exposed the ruins of last night's battle. The inn stood there stalwart but tattered its scorched roof and shattered walls, a testament to the gang's fury. James Carter sat on the porch. His arms bruised, his rifle lying beside him. The burden of survival weighed heavily on his bones. The town was silent, the mayor's men and their hired guns gone, but their threat still lingered like the smoke curling from smoldering rafters. James's eyes followed the horizon where the first rays of sunlight tinged the hills with gold. He sensed something was changing, a purpose he had not known since his farm collapsed years ago. Emily Stone stepped out, her dress covered in soot, hugging her curves as she carried a tin coffee cup. Her chestnut hair fell loose, framing her face. As she handed him the cup, her fingers brushed his warm and lingering, stirring a fire he pushed aside for the family he had sworn to protect. Her blue eyes looked straight into his, gentle but fierce, a quiet strength that made his chest ache with something more than desire. Sarah Brooks joined them, her blouse torn at the shoulder, revealing skin kissed by the morning light. Her chestnut hair flew in the wind like a defiant flame. She leaned against the railing close enough that her scent, gunpowder and sage mixed with the dawn air, mixed with the air. And when her arm brushed his, the touch was a spark, fleeting but undeniable. "We held it," she said, her voice soft, her steely gray eyes meeting his with shared determination. Inside, Emily's son, Tommy, and Sarah's daughter, Clara, are helping injured lodger Eli. Their little hands were steady despite the chaos they had endured. James saw himself in their hopes, a boy who had lost his father too soon, and he knew he couldn't leave. The inn was more than just planks and nails. It was a home theirs built on loyalty and sacrifice, not blood. Emily's hand rested on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. Sarah's eyes held the promise of battles to come together. The mayor would be back, James knew, with papers or guns. But this family, unconventional, scarred, unbreakable, will stand. As the sun rose, warming the porch, James felt the burden of his past lifted, replaced by a quiet certainty. He was no longer a wanderer, but a man with a place, a purpose, a home. The frontier stretched endlessly before them, cold and unforgiving, but they would face it as one. The hooves of James' old friend, Ben Travis, echoed in the distance, fading away. He had done his job, a wandering gunman, delivering timely help, and then disappearing into the wild night, leaving behind a glimmer of hope for those he had helped. James knew that Ben would always be there, somewhere out there, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the West, there were rays of kindness and friendship. And so in that dusty little town in the harshness of Wyoming, a family was formed, not of flesh and blood, but of fire and resilience. James Carter, the cowboy who had lost everything, now found a new purpose. He was not just the protector of this home, but the pillar of an unusual family, one shaped by terrifying nights and hopeful dawns. Emily and Sarah, two strong women who had defied fate, now had a man standing with them, a man who had chosen to stay not for money or duty, but for something deeper, love and loyalty. The fragile peace of the morning was only a reprieve. James knew the mayor would not give up and the gang would return. But this time they were ready. The walls of the inn may have been broken, but the spirit of those who lived inside had not. They had learned to fight, to trust each other, and most importantly, to survive. As James looked out at the horizon where the sun was rising, he saw not the despair of the past, but the promise of a future. A future uncertain, fraught with danger, but one he would not face alone. The laughter of Tommy and Clara, echoed from within, a symphony of hope, dispelling the memories of the gunshots and screams of the night before. It was the sound of a home built on dirt and blood, but as solid as the surrounding mountains. And James Carter, the man who once lost his way, has found his way. A path that leads to a home, a family, and a purpose greater than anything he has ever known. The Wyoming frontier is still a wild and unforgiving place, but now he has a reason to fight, a reason to live. And in the golden light of dawn, their story is just beginning. If this tale of frontier courage, heart, and family has touched you, please like, comment, and subscribe for more stories from the Wild West.